Sometimes a woman discovers that her life has been quietly preparing her for a moment she did not choose. It often arrives without fanfare: a sleepless night, a sentence that stays in the body, a gaze that lingers too long, or a silence on the phone that weighs more than any argument. On the surface, nothing dramatic is happening. You go to work, you answer messages, you smile in the right places. Yet beneath that ordinary rhythm, something in you has begun to stir, as if an invisible tide is turning in the dark. Jung called this kind of interior turning synchronicity, not just coincidence, but meaningful alignment between outer events and inner readiness. You are listening now not by accident, but because a part of you is already standing at the threshold. For a long time, you may have lived inside a delicate equilibrium. Outwardly, you had a man. His body was near you. His name glowed on your phone. He said the right words often enough to sustain the story: I love you. I miss you. I'm here. This was the visible relationship, the one the persona could point to. In Jungian psychology, the persona is the mask we wear to function in society, the role that says, look, I am loved. I am chosen. I am not alone. It is not false, but it is partial. The persona knows how to post the photo, introduce the partner, narrate the couple. What it cannot confess is the quiet dread in your chest when the messages slow down, or the strange hollowness that creeps in even when he is sitting right beside you. The unconscious tells a different story. At that deeper level, you have known for some time that having his body is not the same as having his soul. You have felt the difference between a man who is simply there and a man who is inwardly tethered to you, even at a distance. Jung would say that the true bond does not happen between two social personas, but between two unconscious minds that recognize each other. This recognition is invisible. You cannot photograph it. Yet you feel it in your nervous system, the way your body softens when you sense his genuine presence, the way your intuition goes quiet when you know he is emotionally elsewhere, even if he is texting, even if he is smiling. Here we touch one of the first thresholds in your journey, the realization that possession is an illusion. To have a man in the Jungian sense would mean to live in the symbolic space of his psyche, to inhabit his emotional memory, to become part of that inner landscape he cannot simply detach from or forget. This is not about control, it is about resonance. When a man is emotionally attached, he does not need your constant presence to feel you. You appear in his thoughts without effort, in fragments of music, in the way he turns his head at a familiar scent. Your image becomes an inner symbol, charged with meaning for his soul. But here's the paradox. This kind of bond does not arise when you are busy trying to secure it. The more a woman performs for love adjusting, pleasing, trying to be the right one, the more she anchors herself at the level of persona. The mask shines brighter, but the soul grows dim. Jung would say that the energy of the self, the deeper center of the psyche, cannot move freely while you are imprisoned in the need for validation. Only when a woman begins to withdraw her life force from the performance of being lovable, when she starts to live from her own center rather than from fear of abandonment, does her energy shift. Without fanfare, she stops broadcasting need and begins to radiate authenticity. On a psychological level, this shift is seismic. The male unconscious is exquisitely sensitive to it. Beneath his opinions, beneath his habits, he is carried by archetypal patterns, the deep, universal images that live in the collective unconscious. When a woman stands in her own being, without begging to be seen, she awakens in a man an ancient stirring, not merely desire, but recognition. She stops appearing as an object to possess and becomes instead a mirror in which his own unlived depths shimmer. It is here, often quietly and without clear reason, that the bond begins. There comes a moment subtle, almost private, when the equilibrium of the familiar world fractures. What breaks is not the relationship itself, not the routines or the shared memories, but the shell of the persona that once kept everything in order. Jung taught that every transformation begins with a crack in the mask, a faint tremor in the facade through which the unconscious slips. It may happen through a question he cannot answer, a distance you cannot ignore, or a night in which your body suddenly refuses to tolerate the quiet ache you have normalized. Whatever the trigger, it signals the beginning of the liminal phase, the threshold between who you have been and who you are becoming. In this liminal space, the world feels strangely dreamlike. Ordinary conversations become charged with double meanings. His silence echoes louder than it should. Your intuition grows sharper, almost too sharp, as if your psyche is listening not to his words but to the spaces between them. This is not fantasy. It is the awakening of the unconscious, where instinct and symbol speak a language older than logic. Jung wrote that when the unconscious begins to rise, it does so with uncanny timing, arranging outer and inner events to create meaning. You may notice synchronicities, a line from a book that feels aimed at your chest, a song resurfacing at the exact moment you think of him, a dream that seems to know something you have not yet admitted. These are not coincidences, but communications from the deeper layers of psyche, urging you inward. The liminal phase is uncomfortable precisely because it strips away certainty. You begin to see that much of what you once called love was effort, anxious tending, careful shaping, constant offering. It was the maintenance of a bond rather than the bond itself. Your body knows this before your mind does. There is an exhaustion that feels older than the relationship, older even than the man. It lives in your shoulders, in your throat, in the habit of apologizing before you speak. This is where the shadow begins to stir. In Jungian terms, the shadow holds everything you have exiled in order to be acceptable: your anger, your longing, your ambition, your ferocity, your erotic charge, your unclaimed power. When you feel the impulse to withdraw, to stop explaining, to stop contorting yourself, it is the shadow knocking at the door, asking to be recognized. At first, the shadow arrives as discomfort. You may feel irritation at his indifference, a sudden resentment toward the imbalance, or a strange desire to disappear from his life altogether. These impulses can frighten you because they contradict the persona of the good woman, the patient one, the understanding one. Yet these reactions are not signs of failure, they are signs of awakening. The psyche is preparing you for descent, for the journey into the underworld where your unclaimed self waits. Descent is never literal. It is the slow, interior unraveling of illusions. You begin to notice that the way he holds you does not match the way he thinks of you, that his compliments soothe the surface but leave you hollow, that your dream of him is richer than your experience of him. These realizations sting, but they are necessary. Jung wrote that one cannot individuate, one cannot become whole without passing through disillusionment, without letting the false gods fall. The man who once felt like your axis begins to lose his symbolic power, not because he has changed, but because you are no longer willing to abandon yourself in order to maintain his image. As the descent deepens, you may feel both longing and detachment at once. This contradiction is not confusion. It is the psyche separating genuine eros from the persona's performative attachment. Eros, in Jung's usage, is the connective principle of the psyche, the life force that binds soul to soul. When eros awakens, it seeks truth, not fantasy. And so you begin to feel the difference between wanting him and needing him, between loving him and using him as a shield against your own loneliness. This liminal stage marks the beginning of your inner withdrawal, the quiet reclaiming of your psychic energy. You may not say anything. You may still respond to his messages, still show up when he asks, but inwardly, a door has closed. The thread that once tied your worth to his attention begins to loosen, and with each small loosening, the unconscious prepares you for the deeper journey ahead, the confrontation with the shadow, the meeting with the ancestral feminine, the release from the father complex, and the emergence of your own sovereign self. The descent into the underworld of the psyche never announces itself with thunder. It begins instead with a subtle dimming of the familiar world, as if the outer landscape loses a shade of brightness while your inner landscape sharpens into painful clarity. Jung often described this phase as an antiodromia, the turning of a thing into its opposite. What once felt secure now feels fragile. What once felt necessary now feels suffocating. And what once seemed impossible to question now lies exposed beneath your gaze. This is the moment when your soul begins to reclaim what has long been abandoned in the name of love. At first, the descent feels like loneliness. You may notice yourself pulling back, not dramatically, but with a quiet sincerity that surprises even you. The woman who once anticipated his needs, who monitored her tone, who absorbed every emotional shift like a psychic barometer, suddenly finds her body refusing these old roles. She sits in silence longer. She responds later. She no longer offers explanations preemptively. This is not indifference. It is the psyche drawing its energy home. Jung taught that libido, the psychic life force, withdraws from external objects when the soul prepares for transformation. What looks like emotional distance is actually the first step toward individuation. Yet descent also summons your shadow, and shadow is never gentle. It brings with it the very emotions you have suppressed for years, the anger at being unseen, the envy of women who seem effortlessly cherished, the longing for a man who is both lover and witness, the desire to be chosen fully, not halfway. These emotions are not flaws, they are signals from the unconscious. When a woman denies her anger, it burrows into the shadow and appears later as self-blame. When she denies her longing, it returns as hunger for validation. When she denies her erotic vitality, it re-emerges as anxious attachment. The descent gives her no choice but to face these forces directly. In this underworld, dreams become potent guides. You may dream of vast houses with locked rooms, of water rising in familiar streets, of strangers who speak in riddles, of losing your voice or suddenly discovering you can fly. These dreams are not random. In Jungian psychology, dreams are expressions of the objective psyche, the layer of the unconscious that speaks in archetypal symbols. The locked rooms often represent disowned aspects of the self. Rising water signals overwhelming emotion. Flight often marks the liberation of a repressed instinct. Each dream is an invitation to descend further, to uncover what your waking life has avoided. Here you may also encounter the roots of the transgenerational feminine. Many women discover that the pattern of overgiving, self-erasure, or emotional chasing did not begin with them. It belongs to mothers and grandmothers who lived in eras where a woman's safety depended on male approval. Jung emphasized that the collective unconscious carries the inherited psychic material of the lineage. When you feel an inexplicable grief while pulling away from a man, it may not be just your grief, it may be the ancestral grief of women who never had the freedom to let go. Your pain becomes a ritual undoing of the past. You are not only descending for yourself, you are descending for those who could not. Amid this darkness, another figure emerges, the father complex. Whether your father was loving, distant, critical, or absent, he imprinted the blueprint of what male approval means in your psyche. Jung taught that the father complex shapes a woman's relationship with authority, ambition, and masculine energy. When you realize that your longing for this man mirrors an old longing to be seen by your father, the descent deepens. You start to distinguish the man before you from the archetype he activates. This separation is crucial. Without it, you remain bound to the compulsion to earn love, to perform worth, to be good enough at last. The underworld reveals this truth gently but relentlessly. You have been seeking from men the very self-recognition you have withheld from yourself. In that recognition, something shifts. You begin to feel the faint pulse of the self, the inner organizing center of the psyche, the source of meaning calling you forward. The descent does not end here. It widens. The old story collapses. The old identity loosens. But now, for the first time, you sense that the darkness is not an abyss, but a womb. Something is forming at the depths, something fiercely your own. And soon, the unconscious will ask you to face the deepest mirror of all the anima within the man, and the awakening of eros within yourself. There comes a turning in the descent when the darkness around you begins to differentiate, revealing shapes, contours, and hidden structures that were always there but invisible under the old light. This is the stage in which you encounter the anima, not your anima, but his. Jung taught that every man carries within him an inner feminine figure, the anima, the psychic image of woman that mediates his emotional life, intuition, and capacity for connection. Most men are unconscious of her presence, yet she governs more of their behavior than their rational minds ever admit. And when a woman appears who resonates with this inner archetype, something ancient awakens within him, often without his consent. This awakening is what you once confused for destiny. It is why he thought of you at odd hours, why he reached out without reason, why his voice softened when he spoke your name. It is why he feared you and wanted you in the same breath. His anima recognized you long before his ego did. Your presence stirred something in him that had slept for years, his intuitive knowing, his longing for emotional refuge, his buried vulnerability. But here, in the underworld, you see the fuller truth. His anima recognized you because you embodied parts of himself he had never made conscious. You were not simply a lover, you were a mirror. Yet this recognition is double-edged. When a man is uninitiated into his own depths, the awakening of the anima feels destabilizing. He may retreat, sabotage, rationalize, or claim confusion, not because you are too intense, but because the unconscious bond threatens the ego's illusion of control. Jung wrote that the anima is both muse and disruptor. She invites a man into emotional truth, but also confronts him with the very feelings he has spent a lifetime avoiding. Without inner maturity, he attempts to silence her by distancing himself from the woman who evokes her. And so you found yourself in the paradox. He felt you deeply, but could not stay. He desired connection, but retreated from the very vulnerability connection required. In this underworld place, something essential crystallizes within you. You begin to separate his soul's response from his ego's capacity. You see that he was drawn to your depth, but unprepared for it. You see that his attachment was real, but his readiness incomplete. And in this clarity, you retrieve a piece of your power. For the first time, you understand that his inconsistency was not a verdict on your worth. It was a map of his own fragmentation. His anima stirred, but his psyche could not hold the charge. And so the descent turns inward again, this time toward the forgotten chambers of your own erotic energy, not erotic in the narrow sexual sense, but in the Jungian sense of eros, the connective, enlivening principle that links the ego to the soul. For years, your eros flowed outward, seeking, offering, soothing, anticipating. Now, in the quiet of the underworld, you begin to feel it turning toward you. This shift is subtle but unmistakable. You feel it in the way your breath deepens when you are alone, in the sudden pleasure of your own company, in the return of impulses you once suppressed, the desire to create, to move, to feel, to speak without softening your voice for someone else's comfort. What you are discovering is the restoration of inner authority. Jung believed that true psychic transformation occurs when libido, the life force, is reabsorbed from external figures and redirected toward the self. In this moment, the man is no longer the central symbol of your emotional life. He becomes instead a catalyst, the figure who revealed the gap between who you have been and who you are meant to become. The pain of losing him, or the pain of wanting him and not being met, is the very fire that burns away the old persona, the old patterns, the old inheritance of women before you. And something else begins to happen. The longing you once projected onto him turns into a longing for your own wholeness. This longing is ancient. It belongs not only to your personal story, but to the lineage of every woman who is taught to seek her reflection in a man's gaze. Now, in the underworld, that spell has broken. You are not rising yet, but the ground beneath you is shifting, preparing for a rebirth that will no longer depend on being chosen, but on choosing yourself. When the psyche is ready to rise, it does not do so in triumph, but in stillness. The underworld quiets. The frantic longing subsides. The ache that once clung to your ribs loosens its grip, not because the story has resolved, but because you have. Here, You enter the most delicate stage of transformation, the slow ascent into sovereignty. Jung taught that individuation, the alignment of ego with the self, unfolds not through dramatic insights, but through a subtle reorganization of inner life. Something shifts in the way you inhabit your body, the way you speak to yourself, the way you breathe when you wake before dawn. The emotional signature of your days begins to change. This ascent is not a rejection of love, but a redefinition of it. You no longer reach for the man as an anchor. Instead, you become attentive to what the bond revealed within you. You begin to discern how much of your attachment was woven from old wounds, the father complex whispering its familiar promises, the ancestral fear of being alone, the persona's craving for validation. But now these patterns appear not as chains, but as relics. They cannot hold you in the old way. The woman who once contorted herself for scraps of reassurance starts instead to guard her silence, her time, her reality. She no longer begs for clarity, she embodies it. This shift confuses others, especially the man whose unconscious once recognized you so intensely. He feels the change without understanding it. His anima still remembers you, your presence, your steadiness, the way your authenticity stirred the part of him he had long suppressed. And yet now, instead of leaning toward him, you stand within yourself. Jung wrote that when a woman withdraws her projection, when she stops using a man as the vessel for her unlived life, she becomes powerful in a way the masculine psyche cannot easily categorize. She is no longer the muse, the fantasy, the balm. She becomes the sovereign. This sovereignty is not arrogance, it is clarity. You begin to understand the distinction between emotional bond and emotional dependency. A bond can survive distance, silence, change. Dependency collapses the moment its object shifts. For the first time, you feel the difference in your bones. You can love him without abandoning yourself. You can desire him without diminishing your own truth. You can acknowledge the connection without surrendering your dignity to it. This is the rebirth Jung described as the emergence of the self, the center that is not defined by fear, by longing, or by another person's attention. And yet, rising into sovereignty brings a new kind of solitude, not loneliness, but altitude. You look around and realize that the air is thinner here, quieter, more hauntingly honest. You see how few people live from this place. You feel the ache of shedding the old patterns and the strange exhilaration of becoming someone you have never been. This is the psychological loneliness of initiation. You are not separate, you are simply ahead. From this height, something extraordinary occurs. Your transformation sends ripples into the collective feminine unconscious. Jung believed that when a woman awakens to her own depth, she does not awaken alone, she awakens for the lineage. Your sovereignty becomes a signal to other women still entangled in the same ancestral patterns. Your clarity becomes their permission. Your refusal to shrink becomes their memory of another possibility. By stepping into yourself, you alter the psychological landscape around you. And then, quietly, you come home. Not to him, not to the past, but to yourself. You realize that the entire journey, the bond, the longing, the descent, the shadow, the ancestral grief, the father complex, the awakening of Eros was never meant to secure a man. It was meant to restore you to your inner throne. The man was a mirror, a catalyst, a chapter, but the destination was always the self. And so you stand now in the center of your own life, feeling the gravity of your wholeness. You understand at last that true love does not diminish consciousness, it expands it. True connection does not bind it, liberates. True depth does not require losing yourself, it requires finding yourself so fully that love becomes an expression of freedom rather than fear. Because the deepest truth is this: the self is the only place from which real love can begin. If this journey resonated with you, consider liking, sharing, or subscribing to continue exploring Jungian depth psychology, feminine sovereignty, and the inner landscapes where love and consciousness meet. I welcome your reflections in the comments. Your story is part of the collective unfolding.